Well, one of the biggest challenges we face as football reporters is sitting in a dull press conference and then trying to craft an interesting story from it. Occasionally, people like Jose Mourinho and Ruben Amorim will throw us a little bit of gold to work with, but it's not always the case. So to break down the relationship between managers and the media, we're joined by ESPN's Tom Hamilton and Tim Percival, communications lead of the England team at the RFU. Tim, you've just had a book published, On the Record and on the Ball, How Elite Coaches Master the Media. Can you just tell us a little bit about the book and what was the inspiration behind it?
Yeah, thanks for having me on. The book, I just thought people would be interested in it, really. It's not a subject that gets an enormous amount of, there's not an enormous amount written about it. So I thought people would be interested, first and foremost. And you'll know this, Rob, from your time as a reporter, is that sometimes sometimes there can be some friction between head coaches and the media, and it was my way of trying to kind of make both sides understand each other a bit better. So hopefully it does that, and hopefully it's a good read at the same time too.
You've spoken to a fair few of the world's football coaches, from Ange Postecoglou to Steve Cooper to Graham Potter to Emma Hayes. What were sort of the best anecdotes that really stuck with you from all the interviews you did?
Oh, I got loads, but there's some really good ones, and but one of the most interesting guys I spoke to, who was kind of really thought provoking, was Tony Pulis, who obviously isn't kind of managing at the moment, but he was really, really thought provoking, and he clearly thought a lot about that side of his job, perhaps more so than I gave him credit for. I'll give you an example. So there's a chapter in the book about mind games, and I argue that there's kind of 5 different types of mind game, one of which is reverse psychology. And he told me that when he was Stoke manager, in the first couple of seasons, he didn't lack for kind of material to use on his squad, to say the kind of world's against them. He'd have stuff in the media all the time, not giving them a chance. They were favourites to go down, etc. Anyway, he came to the 3rd season, and he said because they'd performed quite well in the 2 previous seasons, they were starting to be expected to win certain games. So I said to him, "What did you do then?" And he said, "Well, I just made stuff up. So I just walk into the changing room, walk into team meetings, and I would make things up that the media had said, in order to try and galvanise his squad to try and create this kind of feeling that no one gave them a chance," which I thought was just fascinating.
Did you with in The Last Dance, where Michael Jordan basically says that he fabricated a scenario with a player? The guy said, "See you in the gym," or whatever. Have you seen that with other coaches as well? I know perhaps one of your guys you've worked with in the past may or may not have done that as well. But in terms of football, do you think that's an effective tactic, or do you think there's got like a bit of a shelf life?
Yeah, I mean, I certainly think that there are examples where that reverse psychologist, worked in the past. I definitely do. I think the issue, and I think, like sports psychologists, performance psychologists would probably tell you this, is kind of where do you go next? So you can't keep doing that. And, I suppose I'll make the point in the book is that, Mourinho was a kind of master of creating this kind of siege mentality and using this kind of reverse psychology as a tool. But, he doesn't often stay in jobs more than, maybe 3 or 4 seasons, and maybe he kind of runs out of material. But without question, I think it's effective with certain teams. But where you have to be careful is, where do you go next? And also, you don't necessarily want to kind of alienate the team to the media, which I also don't think is particularly wise.
Are there any common mistakes, do you think, when we see managers handle the media? Things that you see, maybe managers you spoke to for the book have kind of said that they made mistakes when handling the media. Is there anything in particular that you think is a wrong way to do it? Have you seen instances of that?
Yeah, I suppose the one that sticks out to me is, I think body language is really, really important in an interview. And, I think it's something like 70 to 80% of, what you say is, via your kind of body language. People are picking up on those kind of visual cues, aren't they? And I think particularly in the Premier League, kind of looking beleaguered when you walk into press conferences and post-match flash interviews, I think is a mistake. And I think football managers need to be really careful about that. And I think it is a mistake that they can fall into. It is a trap. And don't get me wrong, it's incredibly hard, isn't it? You come off a bad defeat or a poor decision, and then suddenly there's a microphone under your nose and you're being interviewed in the tunnel not long after enormous amounts of pressure. But I think that football managers need to kind of train themselves to go into a kind of press conference, particularly in those kind of high pressure moments when things are tense, and train themselves to get into a mindset where they look bulletproof. Because I think journalists can pick up on those kind of visual cues, and their editorial will reflect that.
It's interesting because it's interesting you talk about the timing of the interviews, because obviously I have to deal with Ruben Amorim quite a lot, and one of the things that they say about him at United is that he doesn't give post-match dressing room debriefs because he feels like he's too emotional. So he won't ever talk to the players because he just feels that he's too emotional, and he'll do it the next day. But obviously he can't get away from handling his media duty. So he's comes off games which, if you look at his reign, invariably have been with poor results. Gets a microphone thrust under his nose. He's got to kind of answer these questions on the hop. And actually the one that he gave after Grimsby, he was very, very emotional and kind of said all this stuff that actually made the result even worse, because all this stuff that he came out with about, we have to talk to the board and you can change a manager but not 22 players. All this stuff made the situation worse. And he said afterwards in his next pre-match press conference, he was just simply too emotional. That actually what he needed to do is go and sit in a dark room for 10 minutes, kind of gather his thoughts, and then come out and be a bit more kind of measured. But he just didn't have the time to do that.
I mean, that doesn't surprise me. Someone as smart as him, because I think he's a brilliant media operator, but also there's a bit of self-leadership there in recognising where he's made a mistake. I mean, I think he's a brilliant media operator. He is honest to a fault, as you say. I mean, probably too honest after that Grimsby game. But there's something about his honesty that is really endearing, and it builds connections with the supporters. I know they want better results, but I think honesty is certainly a way of kind of building those connections and respect with supporter base. Just anecdotally on the Grimsby thing, he doesn't need my advice because I think he's a brilliant operator, and particularly his command of language for someone who's speaking in his second language, really, really impressive, and that's a great skill in itself. But just on the Grimsby game, I don't know what your thoughts on this, but the one thing that I was just surprised about in that, and this is more of a kind of psychological kind of observation, is that he didn't watch the penalties, did he, in the closing moment? And I was just amazed by that. I would love to know what a psychologist would make of that. But that is the perception of not watching those just really, really surprised me that he chose to do that.
Yeah, the penalties thing I thought was a little bit odd. I know that players don't. I mean, Casemiro doesn't watch penalties, apparently. That if he's on the pitch and his teammate is taking a penalty, will turn his back and face the other way. It's just a superstition thing, and I think it's the same with Amorim. But you're right. I mean, I think it was interesting after that Grimsby game that kind of meme that went round of him with his tactics board, him not watching the penalties, and then all the stuff that happened in the post-match press conference all contributed to this kind of like disaster scenario that had grown far bigger than the actual result. If he kind of managed the other bits in a different way, maybe the result wouldn't have been. I mean, it's obviously a bad result. You can't get away from that, but it wouldn't have been hung out as such a bad result if he'd handled the different elements of it differently.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, and again, I don't know what you think, Tom, but I just think it's something about the perception of that, of kind of, I don't know, but perhaps it's just me, but it kind of shows kind of anxiety and you don't want to, you want to be seen kind of fronting up and being stoic and part of the group and together. But he went and sat on his own and watched them. I was just surprised by that. Well, and just in the context of whilst we're talking about body language, I suppose.
What have you made of the way that Ange Postecoglou handles media? I know that you've got him in your book. We saw him at the end with Spurs. He was almost quite defiant, but also realistic and very abrasive at times. At Forest already, first press conference, I'd say it's him putting down a marker, the way that he was trying to say who he is again, and he knows that he has people who doubt whether he was the right man for the job and doubt him as a manager. He seems to be quite abrasive and seems to try and go on the front foot. Is that just his nature, or do you think that's a carefully planned tactic from him?
Well, I just think he is unapologetically himself, which I love. And like the first piece of advice I'd give to anyone giving a media interview, whether it was like, the chief exec of, a company or a football manager, is to kind of be yourself. And I think he is unapologetically kind of Ange Postecoglou. And that authenticity, I think, really helps him build, again, connections with people. I also think he's one of those guys who kind of, instead of speaking, he wants to be heard. He wants to get his messages across, and there's kind of no polish there. And he's just that kind of knockabout Aussie that I think that people relate to. I have to say, I think he's an absolutely brilliant communicator. Yeah, he can have a crack at people and you can show some emotion, but I think support bases want you to see you show emotion within reason. I think the most interesting thing he said to me, one of the most interesting things he said to me when I interviewed him for the book, was the importance he puts on kind of fronting up, kind of facing the media, whether it's going well or whether it's, things are challenging. He told me how important that was to kind of front up, try and explain, try and get your messages across. And as you say, show a bit of kind of defiance if things are tough. I just really admire him as a communicator. I think he's great, and I can kind of, and he must be great. He's obviously great for you guys, but I think he kind of connects with people. And I felt sorry for him at Tottenham personally, but that's it.
Who for you stands out in the Premier League then at the moment in the way that they interact and sort of handle the media?
Well, can I cheat?
No. Yeah. All right. Go on.
Well, I mean, if you're going to pick out a really brilliant communicator, you'd have to go for Jurgen Klopp. I mean, lots of the things that we've already spoken about with Amorim and with Postecoglou, where he's kind of authentic and there's humour in there, and again, he's got a great command of language as someone who's speaking in his second tongue. Where I think he was particularly impressive, which was perfectly suited to a club like Liverpool, was that he managed to kind of set the right tone when he's speaking to his support base and the audiences that he spoke to, and I think that is particularly skillful, just kind of setting the right tone. The other thing that made him impressive was that he was prepared to speak about issues beyond football, and the vast majority of football managers won't go there because we live in an age where the slightest kind of transgression you kind of get torn to shreds, don't you? But he was prepared to go in kind of different directions beyond football, and I admire people who want to do that as well, because there is risk there. Gareth Southgate was another one who was prepared to do that, who talked about societal issues and so on and so forth. And that just makes, I have an enormous amount of respect for them. But, Klopp's kind of, range of kind of emotion and passion, I just thought absolute master.
Well, I know we've spoken about Ruben Amorim previously. Obviously, I've had to deal with a lot of Man United managers. I remember Fergie used to say that he used to like long questions in press conferences because it gave him a chance to think of his answer. He hated the kind of short ones because it felt like he caught him off guard. With Jose, obviously everyone will know about how Jose handles the media. What was interesting with Jose, I thought, was that he often used the media to send messages to players, and there was instances when he was at Old Trafford of players messaging journalists to find out what had been said in the embargoed section of press conferences. So they kind of got a heads up about what was coming because they just didn't want to see it drop at 10:30 because they thought that they might get caught off guard. With Amorim, I think a lot of it is, he said himself in his press conference after the game on Saturday. Someone asked him about that Pope quote, and he said, "Oh, I don't know why you're laughing, guys. You all love it, and if you all behave yourself, I'll give you more gold next time." I think that's quite a kind of clever way sometimes of diffusing quite a tough situation. Obviously, that he's going through right now. I mean, what have you made of how he does it? Do you think there's anything he could do better? Have you been quite impressed with the ways? I mean, you mentioned there that he's doing it all in his second language as well, which again I think is worthy of kind of a bit of credit.
Well, I'll give I love the Pope stuff. I thought that was funny, and also didn't he say when Jim Ratcliffe was kind of came into it for a meeting, he said he'd here to offer him as another contract.
First thing he said when he walked in.
And I think, look, I'm going to make just on that humour stuff, I'm going to make a kind of strategic point here, is that humour can be a really clever way of dealing with stuff, particularly particularly if you're under pressure. Where you see it often, I think where some managers are really skillful with it, is that if there's been a kind of controversial moment in the game, and managers know they're going to be asked about that post-match, if they make a joke about something, they can kind of make a point without getting in trouble with the authority, the FA, if you see what I mean. So I remember there was that one from Gary Monk, I think he was the Swansea manager, and there was a big controversial handball, and he said, I didn't realise you could have two goalkeepers. And that's a kind of way of making his point, but without getting himself in trouble. I just think humour, again, you talk about, there's that kind of strategic benefit, but humour, I just think, helps connect with people, and that's what communication is about, isn't it? It's about, you're not just passing on information, you're trying to connect with people. And I think Amorim using kind of humour in the same way that Klopp does, and someone like who's the ex-Blackpool manager who I love, whose name is
Ian Holloway.
Yeah, Ian Holloway. But it's this, something about the way that they use humour, and I think Amorim does that very skillfully, despite the fact that obviously the results aren't as good as he'd like to be at the moment. I think that helps him. As I say, like, I feel like I'm kind of labouring a point, but kind of connect with people and for people to kind of listen to what he's saying.
Just one last one from me. I mean, I know that lots of football fans may listen to this and think, well, what does it matter what managers say in interviews and press conferences? I know that, again, when I was covering United, Ole Gunnar Solskjaer thought that him putting pressure on referees ahead of City games and alerting referees to tactical fouls that Pep Guardiola's team would usually employ, he felt that was really important, and the chance to get it across in public kind of helped his team in those games. And again, Erik ten Hag, United offered him the chance a couple of times for Steve McLaren to take a couple of press conferences just to take the load off, and he said, no, it's really important that the manager of Man United is there to control the message. So obviously managers feel like it's important. Why do you feel like it is important for managers, whether it's rugby or football or whatever sport, to kind of be the voice of that team and control the narrative and the kind of the message around what's happening?
Well, I'd echo those points. I think that's spot on with Ten Hag and Solskjaer. Look, first and foremost, like you're right. The basis of the question is, look, you've got to win games of football, but good communication and understanding some of the stuff that you just summarised, but can buy managers time. You can get messages across that you want to try and articulate, and I think that is incredibly important. I'll give you a good example. Well, hopefully I'll give you a good example. So I remember with Arteta in his first season at Arsenal, he had the Amazon All or Nothing documentary following him around, which, by the way, is incredibly tough for managers, particularly someone like that in a big job. It was his big first head coach role, wasn't it? And I think that despite the fact that I think they had a kind of relatively poor season by their standards, because you could see Amorim, and this isn't necessarily in a press conference, but through that documentary, because you could see how passionate he was for the club, how much he cared about the club, how hard he was working. I think that did a lot to win over an enormous amount of Arsenal's supporter base, and it's for that reason, I think that beyond the results, making sure that you're trying to get those messages across to your supporters and to the boardroom and so on and so forth. That is incredibly important, and it's your opportunity to do that every time you sit in front of the media. So I'd agree with Ten Hag. The sentiment of Ten Hag is that is your opportunity to kind of explain things and to put messages out there and to kind of try and control the message.
On the other hand, what did you make of what Nuno did earlier in the season when he basically pressed the nuclear option and talked about his relationship with Marinakis? Was that, when you saw that, did you immediately think, I know what he's doing here? Like, he's trying to get out? Or...
I mean, I don't want to sound like I'm being wise after the event, but that looked pretty planned. If you ask me, I'll never know, and perhaps we'll never know, but only he will know that. But I think when you start talking about your employers, you're on a pretty dangerous road, and I would say 99.9% of the managers in the whole of the league understand that. I spoke to Harry Redknapp about that actually, and he said that during his time when he was Leeds manager, they sold Ferdinand for that big fee to United, didn't they? And he said he was promised that he'd be able to spend that money, and he said a few things in the press, and he just said, look, the boardroom were watching, and eventually it was thanks very much, goodbye. You look, if you're going to talk about your employers, you can do things, that is an audience you can speak to, and you can be strategic about that. But I think it is a pretty dangerous game. I mean, don't you?
Pretty much, yeah. I think it was quite clear what he was doing at the time.
I think that's the one kind of no-go, isn't it, in press conferences? If you begin talking about your employers and kind of criticising them openly, that immediately people see that there's a rift there that probably should be kept behind closed doors. You're obviously doing that for a reason. Nuno's always manages his press conferences quite well. I feel that he doesn't ever give anything away unless he absolutely wants to. So the very fact that he, for one of the only times I've ever seen him in a news conference, give away something like that suggested that it was very much part of his plan, and that it may not be the next day or the day after, but there was certainly kind of the end was nigh kind of thing.
Yeah, I mean, it just looked so deliberate, didn't it?
I've got one last question. When the managers say that they don't read the media, is that rubbish?
I don't know. I don't know. I mean, going back to Tony Pulis, he told me that he would have an assistant coach read it all and then flag anything, because he's like, look, I don't have time to read it all. I mean, I think not reading stuff is quite hard work, and I know that sounds really daft, but particularly Premier League managers, that they've got friends who are going to be flagging articles and so on and so forth, and it's very, very difficult to avoid the media altogether. But maybe you should do what Tony Pulis does and just get someone else to read it for you and flag anything that you think is a concern. I thought that was a pretty good way of dealing with it.
Well, thanks, Tim, for coming on and offering your insight, and also thanks to Tom for joining us. That was great. Thanks very much.
Oh, you're welcome.